Hello, this is Danny Raymond, the voice behind Ray's Guide. This week we're going to do our first tech preview of jump points operating between Pyro and Stanton working, which will undoubtedly instantly become a stress test, as everybody, and I mean quite literally everybody, rushes to get their first view of the process of the tunnel itself. And by my previously stated standards, that will be the first test that can be generally described as a test of meshing, and not just the replication layer. But as soon as that is stable, the next step will be a static test that has more than one server area in Stanton and more than one server area in Pyro. Because if you don't do that, there really couldn't be any particular reason to just not have the old-style map servers and transition screen. Which brings up a very important question. And that is, how do you subdivide Stanton and Pyro for the purposes of assigning servers to it? Because there are many really bad ways of doing it, a few not bad ways of doing it, and perhaps only one or two really good ways of doing it. Now, one comment from my last video regarding meshing had me realizing that some people were taking the demonstration at the last Citizencon a little too literally, and that the way that Stanton and Pyro would be subdivided would be into little cubes, room by room, which would be an absolutely terrible way to subdivide an entire dynamic solar system. I'm not criticizing the demonstration, showing 3 rooms as a way to put the concept at a scale small enough to show live on a single screen that it was working and how it was working. That was great. But now we need to talk about whole solar systems. So first, what are the criteria to decide if a scheme for dividing a solar system is in the terrible, the not too bad, or the actual good category? First and foremost, it must absolutely ease and not complicate, or even worse, prevent this becoming an automated dynamic server mesh. A dynamic server mesh is one where the servers can be split or removed to respond to how players are congregating. And an automatic dynamic server mesh is one where a sysop need not be involved with making those decisions. Second, and this is almost as important, it must not seriously complicate, or even worse, prevent, implementing planetary motion. Planetary motion has been pretty much since the launch of 3.0 been, whenever asked, that of course we want to do it, and of course we can do it, but we're going to be doing other things first. And I took that to mean that the events of Squadron 42 happened over such a short period of time that planetary motion could be ignored for Squadron 42. But in the PU, from one quarter release to the next, another planet with an Earth-like year would move a full 90 degrees. If Neil deGrasse Tyson were to evaluate space games like he does space movies, I'm convinced that his first and loudest ridicule of Star Citizen would be that planets don't move over weeks and months of time. I've also mentioned this in relation to the dynamic economy, or astroeconomics, but there's also a gameplay angle. Recently, my YouTube feed sent me a new vid from one of those perpetual critics who depressingly have more subs than me. It was fairly standard stuff. I returned after a year and nothing has changed. He admitted that sure, there was a whole bunch of new salvage and ground locations and stuff, but he doesn't do those things, so nothing has changed. Which struck me as odd. If you deliberately don't include anything that has changed, then by definition, nothing has changed. But if the planets have moved, then by definition, something is changing, no matter what your limited participation is in the game. So, for example, you might consider the pie slice model of subdividing the verse. Put this into planetary motion, though, and you have a complete mess, with the slices often overlapping each other, overtaking each other, and so on. So maybe instead you could consider orbital rings model of subdividing a star system. As long as the planets don't have overlapping orbital paths of highly elliptical orbits, this does a pretty good job of accommodating planetary motion. But that brings up an interesting question. Do the jump points also orbit the star? Which also means that they are unlikely to be right in the planetary plane of the star. But it does also mean that, for example, ArcCorp and its associated Lagrange point would take turns being very conveniently located to the Pyro jump point. But this brings up the third criteria, and that is that the system of subdivision should work at all levels of detail, and you don't have to switch methods when going from the star and planet level to the planet and moon level to the surface level and to the city level. And the orbital rings only works at the star system level and at the planet system level. Then you would have to switch to something else to, say, subdivide Lorville. And that means 2 code bases to be maintained, 2 different data structures, and all the coding to know which one to use when. And then there's the 4th criteria, and that is whether the system of subdivision actually reflects what the universe is and how people use it. Because there are a couple of revelations here. The first is that the verse is mostly empty space, and most of the time it isn't even loaded into memory because nobody's there. This means that when it comes to dividing the space, you really don't need to give each server an equivalent amount of volume to be responsible for because most of it's nothing. So, for example, I'd imagine that most of the time there are more people in the 4 main landing zones of Lorville, Orison, Area 18, and New Babbage than there are in the rest of the entire planets. The second revelation is that when you are looking at splitting a server into 2, you don't have to come up with a division that leaves the 2 of them with equal numbers, only enough that both no longer have too many. So, for example, if the server that is covering just Hurston is getting overloaded and needs to split, you divide it into Lorville and everything else. It doesn't matter that the 2 servers having an equal number of players, only that they both no longer are overloaded. You don't have to give the Lorville server little bits of the rest of Hurston to make it equal, or if it's the other way around, you don't have to give the rest of Hurston little bits of Lorville. Because as long as both of them are, for the moment, okay, it doesn't matter, and it's going to be constantly changing anyway. So let's dig into the technique that I think is the best, and I call this system nested attractions. And in this, I mean attractions in the most general sense. Places that attract people. So let's look at Stanton as a whole. Its top-level attractions are each of the 4 planets, including their respective moons, low-orbit stations, and Lagrange 1 and 2 points. And then lesser attractions are all the Lagrange 3, 4, and 5 points, plus, of course, the 3 jump point stations. Now, each of these attractions, for the purpose of server meshing, is defined by the center point of their respective planet, Lagrange point, jump point, and a radius fully including them, plus a transition buffer. Note that if you get the planets all moving as they should, then every time you update the location of the planet, you automatically update the center point of the server meshing zone because it's the same piece of data. You can't make it simpler than that. So let's say Stanton is just 1 server right now, but it's starting to get overloaded. It analyzes which of the attractions that haven't already been spun off has the most players in it. Let's say it's Greater Hurston, so it spins off a server for Greater Hurston. That will certainly relieve enough of the pressure from Greater Stanton, but if later it doesn't, simply checks the next most populated attraction if that it has not already spun off, and so on and so on. So let's continue then with the example of how Greater Hurston was spun off. Let's presume that over time Greater Hurston server also is getting stressed with more players. Now the Greater Hurston area also has attractions. That's the nested part of the scheme. These attractions being each of the Lagrange points 1 and 2 stations, the orbital station above the planet, each of the moon, and the surface of Hurston itself. And these 2 are defined as a center point that can move and a radius. So let's say that Hurston's surface is selected to be spun off, and if it becomes oversaturated later, it too has attractions of Lorville and each of the various outposts. And then if Lorville is spun off a server, within Lorville, each of the 3 prime player areas, Metro Center, Tiasa Spaceport, and Hurston Headquarters, are attractions, again, with a center point and a radius. And finally, let's say Hurston Headquarters is spun off as a server, and it gets overloaded, then the train station, lobby, Hurston Showcase, and the trading floor could be regarded themselves as separate attractions that can each be abstracted as a center point and a radius, if you select the center points carefully. So we've been able to go from subdividing an entire star system down to a small part of a city, all with the same code base and same schema. And because of the hierarchical relationships, they will all map very well onto the ND Graph database, if in fact they aren't already there. Is this how CIG is going to do it? I don't know, but you would have a hard time convincing me that it is not the best way to do it. Now for an update on our giveaways, we continue to make progress towards our goal of giving away the Zippy Zazzy Zaftig Zephyr, the Zeus 2 cargo, as well as our larger goal, the magnificent multi-role mining meta, the Arasta. 1 entry per video, be a member for automatic entry on any video published while your membership is active, or subscribe and comment, including the secret word. And the secret word for this video is the generic name for a place that attracts people. Fly safe, keep it real, and I'll see you in the verse. This is Daniel Raymond for Ray's Guide.